The Blind Man and the Lame Man. Many, many full moons ago there lived two friends. One was blind, the other was lame. Both men were miserably poor. They sat by the roadside begging all day in the hot sun. At first, the people who passed by took pity on the two men and dropped coins into their begging bowls, but as the months wore on, the villagers got used to the sight of the blind man and the lame man. No longer did they feel much pity for them. Fewer and fewer coins were dropped into the little begging bowls. It reached a stage where at the end of the day, the two friends had barely collected enough money to buy one plate of food. One day, the two friends reached a decision. They would leave the village to look for somewhere better to live. Surely, they reasoned, nowhere could be worse than this. The blind man was strong, but he could not see. The lame man could not walk, but he was cunning. When the two traveled, the blind man would lift the lame man up onto his shoulders. The lame man would then guide the blind man. Several hours later, they reached a forest. The blind man was tired from carrying his lame friend all day, and his shoulders ached, so they decided to stop and rest for the night. That evening, the blind man and the lame man set a few traps. They then went to bed, tired and hungry. The next morning, the two friends woke up at dawn, their stomachs rumbling from hunger. They went to examine their traps and, to their surprise, found that they had caught a few large birds. The two friends could not believe their good fortune. They rejoiced, instantly forgetting their hunger and discomfort. After washing, they made the long journey to the market. In no time, they had sold the birds for a good price. With the money, they bought some food. There was change left over, and so they decided to buy a knife to help them cut sticks which could be used to make more traps. The two friends arrived at their home and set several traps before retiring for the night. The next day they were amazed at their continuing good fortune when they found that every trap they had set now contained a large, juicy bird. The two friends couldn't believe their luck.
"At last, God is smiling on us,"
the lame man said.
"He must have heard our prayers,"
the blind man replied. The two friends discussed their sudden good fortune and agreed that since this place was good to them, they would remain a while. It would not be difficult to build a house and cultivate a farm. That day at the market, things continued to go well. In no time, the two friends sold all their game for a good price. With a large part of the money, they bought a machete. This they planned to use in clearing the land for their farm. It was afternoon when the blind man took the lame man on his back, and they went into the forest. After searching for a while, they found an old, disused farm where the undergrowth had not grown very thick. They spent the rest of the day clearing the bush. Actually, it was the blind man that did most of the work. The lame complained that he was too weak to work and sat by the edge of the farm guiding the blind man on where to work. When the sun was setting, he simply told the blind man it was time to go back to their camp. The blind man knew that he did most of the work but did not mind. He had a kind heart and was very fond of his lame friend. Day after day they went to the farm. The blind man worked while the lame man talked. In this manner the bush was burned and the land cleared. Finally the land was ready for planting. Now they needed seed to plant, so they set several traps. Luck was still on their side. All their traps were occupied the next day. With the game that was caught, they could afford to buy plenty of good seed. There was a large variety of seed on sale at the market. The lame man told the blind man what there was, describing the dozens of metal bowls piled high with lots of different types of seed, including wheat, maize, millet, and beans. The blind man thought a moment. He decided that maize would be the best seed to buy since this crop fetched the best prices. The lame man agreed. They went from stall to stall inspecting the maize seed for sale. The blind man cautioned the lame man to be careful and buy a good grain of maize, one that would ripen quickly and was not diseased. They bought the maize and planted it. Then they went home to rest. A week later, the two friends went out to the farm to see if the maize was sprouting. The blind man and the lame man stood on the edge of their farm. The lame man looked out at the farm, which was now covered with little green shoots of maize. The blind man asked him what he saw. The lame man kept silent for a while. Then he said that there were no shoots to be seen. The blind man was disappointed. He said that perhaps they were too eager, perhaps they should give it more time. And so the two friends went back home. A few days later, the two friends went back to the farm. The lame man again deceived the blind man, saying that no shoots had yet come out of the ground. The blind man grew impatient. He turned to his friend and accused him of being careless and buying bad seed. The lame man denied the accusation, though he continued to deceive the blind man. The weeks passed and the maize grew sturdy and strong. The warm tropical sun ripened the cobs until finally they were ready for plucking. The lame man realized that the maize could no longer be hidden, so he told the blind man that the shoots were now sprouting. The blind man decided to go and do some work on the farm to remove the weeds. The lame man told the blind man that he should hoe the ground carefully so as not to uproot the delicate shoots. At the farm, while the blind man was clearing the weeds, the lame man plucked a few cobs. He lit a fire and began to roast the cobs, whistling happily to himself. The blind man heard the crackling of the fire. He called out to his lame friend and asked what the noise was. The lame man shouted back, in between chewing mouthfuls of the juicy, succulent cobs, that it was nothing, probably just a falling stick. The blind man could not see, but he could smell and hear. He could smell the delicious roasting cobs and knew the lame man was lying, but he said nothing. When the lame man had eaten his fill, he put out the fire and told the blind man that the sun was setting and it was time to leave. The blind man put the lame man on his back and both went back home. That night, the blind man told the lame man that he had reached a decision.
Life is far too cruel. Just look at us.
He cried in exaggerated despair.
It has left us disabled, outcasts of society, people to be pitied and scorned. The maize we planted will not grow. Surely God has turned his back on us. Let us die.
He went on, grabbing the lame man's arm.
Life is not worth living.
The lame man was concerned at the depth of emotion in the blind man's outburst. He listened to his friend, but his confusion kept him silent. He could not say, "I lied. The maize grew after all. God did not turn his back on us," so he kept silent. They left their home together. The blind man carried the lame man and climbed to the top of a high hill. Down below, the ground was littered with sharp-edged rocks and stones. The blind man put his lame friend on the ground. The lame man leaned forward and peered down the side of the hill at the rocks and stones below. He shivered and turned to the blind man.
My friend,
He said,
as it was your idea, I suggest you jump first. I will follow.
The blind man would not hear of it.
Absolutely not.
He declared,
If I were to jump first, my good friend, what will happen if you are not able to get to the place from which to jump?
He knew the lame man planned to deceive him. The lame man realized that the blind man was not going to allow himself to be tricked, so with a sigh he reluctantly agreed to jump first. After a warm and emotional goodbye in which the two friends hugged each other and cried a little, the lame man hobbled over to the side of the hill. He waited a few moments, then pushed a large stone over the edge. He watched as it tumbled into the abyss and crashed into the ground below. He then sat there quietly, not making a sound. When the blind man heard the noise, he cried out,
Alas, my dear friend, before you went, we should have cleared the bush here, so all might know that two friends had entered the spirit world from this place. Now I am alone. I must do the best I can.
The blind man brought out his machete and began to cut the bushes and trees around him. He hit out wildly, striking everything that was in his path. The lame man was sitting behind a bush which was directly in the blind man's path. He watched the blind man with increasing alarm. He tried to drag himself out of the blind man's path, but knew that he could not move fast enough. He wondered what he must do, and all the time the blind man was getting closer and closer. The lame man watched in horror as it struck the top of the bush. It was so close that, as the chopped grass flew into the air, it hit him in the face. The blind man raised the machete again. The lame man could bear it no longer. He cried out,
Wait!
The blind man faked fury. He accused the lame man of being a cheat and a liar. Both men began to quarrel. Then suddenly, God appeared out of the heavens. Both men were quiet as God told them to stop fighting. He told them that they had not been forgotten and that soon their lot would improve. The two men put aside their differences. The blind man carried the lame man, and they went home. The next day they returned to the farm. The lame man told the blind man that some of the maize was now ripe and ready to eat. They lit a fire. The lame man picked some large juicy cobs. He peeled off the skins and roasted them over the fire. When the cobs were ready, he removed them from the fire and began to eat. The blind man sitting nearby could hear the lame man chewing the succulent cobs, and he waited for his share. Finally, he realized that it was not forthcoming. He demanded that the lame man share the maize with him. The lame man looked at the blind man who seemed so hungry and helpless. Smiling mischievously, the lame man picked up a frog and threw it onto the fire. When it was swollen and blackened, he removed it from the fire with a stick and handed it to the blind man, pretending that it was a cob. The blind man received what he was given gratefully. Hungrily, he bit into the belly of the frog. The frog burst open and its juices splashed into his face. The blind man screamed as liquid stung his eyes. The lame man watched as the blind man ran this way and that, all the time screaming in pain. Suddenly, the blind man stopped in his tracks. His eyes had stopped stinging. He stood still and rubbed his eyes. Then slowly he opened them. Before him, everything was a hazy mist. He blinked several times and slowly everything came into focus. He could see. He turned to see the lame man sitting by the fire holding a large golden cob. Beyond was the farm he had labored over for months. It was full of maize. Overwhelmed by anger, the blind man picked up a stick and thrashed the lame man mercilessly. The lame man was terrified. Blows rained down on him. He begged the blind man to stop, but to no avail. Suddenly, he could bear the pain no longer. He leapt up and ran off in his desperation to get away. A few seconds later, he realized what he was doing. He stopped in his tracks and looked down at his once useless legs, now strong and healthy.
I can walk,
He cried, jumping about wildly. He ran one way and then the other, all the time screaming hysterically. God then spoke to the two men. To the blind man he said,
If the lame man had not given you a frog in deceit, you would never have gained your sight.
To the lame man he said,
If the blind man had not beaten you in anger, you would never have walked. Go home and be friends. You both need each other.
The two men understood the wisdom of God's words. They made up their quarrel and went home. They quarreled no more and prospered from their farm.